Thank you for that. As he mentioned, I'm going to talk more about Twain specifically, who you will hear me call him Clemens most of the time through this lecture. I'm sure most of you are aware that Samuel Clemens, of course, is his birth name, and Mark Twain is his pen name. I have to remind people at our museum of that all the time because we get through a tour and people at the end will say, "Who is this Samuel Clemens guy that lives in Mark Twain's house?" I'm like, it's the same person. So I will be referring to him mostly as that as we go through. So the first time that Samuel Clemens met General Grant was at some point, it's hard to pinpoint exactly when, between 1866 and 1867. And one of Sam's many notebooks recorded his thoughts upon seeing the general. Quote, "This is the simple soldier who, all untaught of the silken phrase makers, linked words together with an art surpassing the art of the schools, and put them into something which will bring to American ears, as long as America shall last, the roll of his vanished drums and the tread of his marching hosts." Little did Clemens know that over the next couple decades, General Grant would become a massive part of his professional and his personal life. Shortly after that first meeting that I just mentioned, Clemens looked forward to their paths crossing again. And in 1868, Clemens, writing for the Alta California, attended a reception for General and Mrs. Grant. His impression of Grant is amusing, to say the least. He says, quote, "I stood against the wall, close by, and watched the reception ceremony for an hour. And I cannot tell when I enjoyed anything so much. Poor, modest, bored, unhappy Grant stood smileless, anxious, alert, with every faculty of his mind intensely bent upon the business before him, and nervously seized each hand as it came, and while he gave it a single shake, looked not upon its owner, but threw a quick lookout for the next. And if for a moment his hand was left idle, his arm hung out from his body with a curve that was suggestive of being ready for business at a moment's notice. And so he seized each hand, passed it on, grabbed for the next, passed it on, grabbed again, and with his soul in his work and that absorbed anxiety in his eye, and it reminded me irresistibly of a new hand catching bricks, a new hand that was full of misgivings, fearful that he might make a miss, but determined to catch every brick that came or perish in the attempt. He is not a large man. He is a particularly plain-looking man. His hair is straight and lusterless. His head is large, square of front and perpendicular in the rear, where the selfish organs of the head lie. He is less handsome than his pictures. And his face, at this time at any rate, lacked the satisfied, self-possessed look one sees in them. He is broad of beam, and his uniform sat as awkwardly upon him as if he had never been in it before. So that is one of Twain's impressions of Grant. After Grant left the presidency, Clemens proclaimed, quote, "I wanted to see the general again anyway and renew the acquaintance. He would remember me because I was the person that did not ask him for an office." They would meet occasionally throughout the 1870s, culminating in a speech that Clemens would craft for the general specifically. In 1879, Clemens had the opportunity to speak at a banquet given by the Army of the Tennessee in honor of Grant. Clemens gave a wonderfully amusing speech titled "The Babies." It is a satirical look at how important babies are and how they are often overlooked and underappreciated, when in reality they are really the future of the country. Clemens commented about the baby, quote, "He is enterprising, irrepressible, brimful of lawless activities. Do what you please, you can't make him stay on the reservation. Sufficient unto the day is one baby. As long as you are in your right mind, don't you ever pray for twins. Twins amount to a permanent riot, and there ain't real difference between triplets and an insurrection." Clemens continued, "Among the 3 or 4 million cradles now rocking in the land are some which this nation would reserve for ages as sacred things, if we could know which ones they are. He saves the best of his speech for the end, where he directs his attention, of course, to the illustrious guest of honor. And in still one more cradle somewhere under the flag, the future illustrious commander-in-chief of the American armies is so little burdened with his approaching grandeurs and responsibilities as to be giving his whole strategic mind at this moment to trying to find some way to get his big toe into his mouth, an achievement which, meaning no disrespect, the illustrious guest of this evening turned his entire attention to some 56 years ago. And if the child is but a prophecy of the man, there are mighty few who had doubted that he succeeded. Grant admitted that he laughed so hard his entire body ached. Clemens considered this one of his best speeches, especially since the usually stoic Grant could not keep his composure. Clemens encouraged Grant to pen his memoirs. They would often get together. By the fall of 1880, Clemens would visit him very frequently while he was living in New York. Clemens, of course, living in Hartford, Connecticut. It would make the trip up quite often for cigars and conversation and dinner, and Clemens really thought that Grant should pen his memoirs, that it's something people really wanted to see. Grant was reluctant and wrote Clemens after their dinner, quote, "I've always distrusted my ability to write anything that would satisfy myself, and the public would be much more difficult to please. In the second place, I am not assessed of the kind of industry necessary to take such a work." A few years later, according to Clemens, he states, "One night in the first week of November, 1884, I had been lecturing and walking homeward. It was a rainy night and but few people were out. In the midst of a black gulf between lamps, two dim figures stepped out of a doorway in front of me. I heard one of them say, 'Do you know General Grant has actually determined to write his memoirs and publish them? He has said so today, in so many words.'" Clemens had known already for quite a while that Grant was planning to pen his memoirs with Century magazine, but he wanted them for his own newly formed publishing company called Charles Webster & Co., named after his nephew-in-law, who would head the new endeavor. And so, I'll get into this a little bit later on, but you can see they eventually have a falling out, and Clemens says about his nephew, in his autobiography, he describes him as one of the most assful persons I have ever met, perhaps the most assful. Not a fan. So Clemens plays his hand very strategically and carefully. He has no problem accepting a dinner invitation from Century Magazine's head, Richard Watson Gilder, where he could gather intel on the negotiations that are taking place between the magazine and Grant. They at first offer Grant $500 apiece for various articles he had written about battles in the Civil War. They are encouraging him as well to want to publish his memoirs, and they are offering him about 10% of the royalty. Clemens is horrified by this. He even jots down that it is not only the monumental injustice of the 19th century, but of all centuries, and that he thinks Century Magazine are really taking advantage of Grant. Clemens also believed that subscription publishing and not trade publishing was the way to go. And so you can see up here, unfortunately in our collection, we do not have what's called a salesman's prospectus for the memoirs, but we do have one in our collection for Adventures of Huckleberry Finn, which is what I have up on the screen now. So if you look all the way to the photograph on the right, you'll see a normal first edition copy of Adventures of Huckleberry Finn on the left, and that very skinny volume next to it is the salesman's prospectus version of it. So you can see it's a lot thinner, a lot smaller, but it was a way to sell books during that time. Clemens made sure this is the only way his books were sold. So they would have canvassers or book agents spread out across the country and go door to door carrying the salesman's prospectus with them. They would knock on your door, and let you look through the book. So you could check out the illustrations, the chapters, maybe read a little bit, and then determine if this is something you were interested in purchasing. You could look at the bindings, which you can see in the middle there, and choose what binding works best for you. And then by the end, if you were convinced that this is a book you must have, there would be an order form at the very back where you would simply write down your name, your address, and what type of book covering or binding you would like. And then they would be able to churn out exactly how many copies were ordered. So it really cut down on extemporaneous costs that no one really needed. This really helped him make a lot of money. And so this is the way that Twain thought Grant's memoirs should sell, not by trade, which would basically be putting them in bookstores. He thought that by doing it his way, Grant would ultimately make a lot more money. So that's another direction he was pushing him into. Grant was hesitant for many reasons, including his loyalty to a deal already in progress with Century Magazine, the reticence of getting into a business deal with a now friend, and finally, the desperation of a man who wants more time to think this all through. So the public embarrassment that he had faced with his failure of the business investment with Grant and Ward, which essentially left him penniless, was hard for him to swallow. Now in financial ruin, his anxiety towards entering another potentially catastrophic business arrangement was very palpable. After seeking advice from trusted individuals in his inner circle, they reviewed Clemens's offer. Now remember, Century Magazine was offering him 10%. Clemens' offer was either 20% of the gross royalty or an astounding 70% of the net profits. The final decision, give the book to Twain. At times, Clemens felt it was necessary to defend himself against claims that he outright stole the book from Century Magazine, even saying, quote, "I seem to fast getting the reputation in the newspapers of being a pushing, pitiless, underhanded sharper, but I don't quite deserve it. General Grant was considering the Century's offer for his book. That is all. There was no understanding. He said I could speak freely and without impropriety. I estimated the sale of the book at 250,000 sets. 2 volumes to the set. At the Century's offer, such a sale would pay him $175,000. At my offer, his pay would amount to $350,000. He had the wisdom to decline Century's offer, and to this day, I can't help thinking he was right. I would have done it myself. Upon my word, I have done nothing underhanded in this whole business. Every step has been taken in the broad daylight, and nothing concealed. Neither have I done anything unfair or in any way dishonorable." Clemens's wife, Olivia, this is her along with their 3 daughters, was nervous about the risk that her husband was taking financially. So Clemens is responsible for putting all the money up front into the sale of Grant's memoirs. And he was getting a very small cut since he wanted to make sure that Grant was getting what he felt was fair and was due. She wondered really if this was all worth it. He reassured her that the amount of books that they would sell would make this a solid investment for them with a very high return. His oldest daughter, Susie, also had misgivings, frustrated that her father was ignoring his own literary responsibilities. She noted, "Mama and I have both been very much troubled of late because Papa, since he has been publishing General Grant's book, has seemed to forget his own books and work entirely. And the other evenings, as Papa and I were down in the library, he told me that he didn't expect to write but one more book, and then he was ready to give up work altogether, die, or do anything else. He said that he had written more than he ever expected to, and the only book that he had been particularly anxious to write was one locked up in the safe downstairs, not yet published." And the unfinished book that Susie refers to is his later work, Captain Stormfield's Visit to Heaven. Already dealing, of course, with the stress of providing for his family, Grant, as we know, was soon facing an adversary even tougher than any he had faced during his time on the battlefield, throat cancer. His fear of choking to death and difficulty sleeping led to immense struggles when it came to working on his memoirs. Clemens was finally alerted to his dire condition by son Fred Grant, who gravely admitted that his father would not be able to recover from this. Initially shocked by this, Clemens steadied himself with the firm belief that Grant would succeed in leaving this eternal monument of his life behind. Grant worked at a frenetic daily pace. Maps were consulted, dates were cross-checked. A stenographer that Clemens hired sat by the ready if Grant was up to dictating when his painful throat allowed him to do so. Clemens, as I mentioned, often made the journey from Hartford to check in on things, the progress, as well as the condition of the general. During his most productive period, Grant could write upwards of 10,000 words a day, along with editing and correcting parts of the manuscript that had been previously worked on. So it is incredible the amount of work that Grant was able to do while facing throat cancer and the daily pain of that. Clemens even goes on to say, "It is curious and dreadful to sit up this way and talk cheerful nonsense to General Grant, he under the sentence of death with that cancer. He says he has made the book too large by 200 pages. Not a bad fault. A short time ago, we were afraid it would lack 400. He has dictated 10,000 words at a single sitting, and he is a sick man. It kills me these days to do half of it." Though most of the time when the two of them got together, they would get straight down to business, Clemens also wanted to make sure he set aside time for laughter and conversation and happier times. So here you can see is an illustration of a visit that Sam makes. There we go. That Sam makes with Grant as well as her father and daughter Susie. So he says Susie remembers visiting on a particular time, accompanied by her father and Major Pond. They went to a dog show at Madison Square Garden. The show was an annual event of the Westminster Kennel Club, patronized by many well-to-do New York families. Susie writes of the show in her unfinished biography of her father called Papa that she wrote at age 13. Quote, "When we got through seeing the dogs, Papa thought he would go and see General Grant, and I went with him. This was April 29th, 1885. Papa went up into General Grant's room, and he took me with him. I felt greatly honored and delighted when Papa took me into General Grant's room and let me see the General and Colonel Grant, for General Grant is a man I shall be glad all my life that I have seen." Despite the amount of work that Grant is churning out, his self-confidence is lacking, in part due to the silence of Clemens. He's really not giving Grant any feedback on what he thinks of his writing. So finally, when Clemens gets word of this, he can't believe that someone who is so revered and stoic as Grant could possibly care about what he had to say or what he thought about his writing. He joked at first about it. Quote, "I was as much surprised as Columbus's cook would have been to learn that Columbus wanted his opinion as to how Columbus was doing his navigating. But later he realized he was venturing upon a new trade, an uncharted sea, and stood in need of an encouraging word, most like any creature of common clay. It was a great compliment that he should care for my opinion and he should desire it. And I took the earliest opportunity to diplomatically turn the conversation in that direction." So as the clock continues to tick by, work continues at a regular and a steady pace. However, on April 29th, the New York World drops a bombshell. The memoirs were not being worked on by the general. They were being produced by a hired ghostwriter. This absolutely enrages Clemens and upsets Grant, as you can imagine, as well. A former soldier who served with Grant in Mexico claimed Grant was no writer and was not able to produce such a feat. Some believed Grant's aide, Adam Badeau, was the true author of the work, while others claimed that Twain himself was responsible for its written words. Clemens immediately threatened to sue the newspaper, and called the world the daily issue of unmedicated closet paper. There are many today, however, that continue to question whether Grant was the actual author of his own memoirs. Despite this report, book canvassers were hard at work, as I mentioned, going door to door in attempts to pitch and sell as many copies as the memoirs as possible. Clemens also made sure that war veterans were hired in large numbers as canvassers and encouraged them to dress up in their old uniform, knowing it would be harder for people to turn them down. They were also given an instruction booklet, 30 pages long, detailing and instructing how to sell the books properly. Some of the advice included in that booklet: avoid men in groups as you canvass. You seldom sell to a man you meet away from home or in his own neighborhood, as when you call upon a man at home, he is personally addressed, especially called upon, and his attention required, which is not the case if you run across him away from home. Also, a man living on a four corners or a crossing is quite an important man to get, for if you can go in 3 different directions and you have an order from the last house, this is beneficial for you. As Grant's health continued to deteriorate, however, it was suggested by his doctors that he be moved from the city to a place where the fresh air and the peaceful environment would make him more comfortable. They found a cottage in Mount McGregor in upstate and moved Grant up there to spend the remainder of his days. And here you can see a page of the manuscript that is held by the Library of Congress today. And here you can see Grant at Mount McGregor working tirelessly on those memoirs. Meanwhile, Clemens was finding success in his professional life. He even revisited his characters Tom Sawyer and Huckleberry Finn and wondered if he could get his famed troublemakers on the path to more adventures, aka more money for him. Twain had an idea to actually put Tom and Huck in an old rebel outfit, the Marion Rangers, during the Civil War. And the story, to reach its culmination, would have a Union soldier accost the boys and say his name, U.S. Grant. Sadly for us, it was never written. However, Clemens did write a piece titled A Private History of a Campaign That Failed about his embellished service in the Civil War. After his Mississippi riverboat career came to an end with the beginning of the war, Sam spent a few days, maybe a couple weeks, hiding out in Missouri with a group of his buddies that they called themselves the Marion Rangers. Their main mission was to just drive away any Union invaders that they may have come upon. It was short-lived, and he suffered from a boil and a sprained ankle, mostly due from hiding in the woods. Instead, he met up with his older brother Orion, and they made their way out west to the Nevada Territory, where he remained for the most part during the war. A lot of people claim that he joined the Confederate Army. There's claims that he even killed someone in a battle. Neither of those things is true. Despite this, Clemens noted during one particular conversation, quote, "Today I talked with General Grant about his and my first Missouri campaign in 1861, in June or July. He surprised an empty camp near Florida, Missouri," that's where Clemens was born, "on Salt River, where I had been occupying a day or two before. How near he came to playing the devil with his future publisher." Grant continued to work on his memoirs, adding, editing, and correcting to the point where Clemens would start to get frustrated by this. The work, however, is what kept Grant going. By the final stages of his writing, Grant admitted, "I said I had been adding to my book and to my coffin. I presume every strain of the mind and body is one more nail in the coffin." On July 19th, Grant finished the seemingly interminable amount of work to his life story, and only 4 days later he died. So this, of course, is the last image of Grant as he's finishing those memoirs. Clemens was visiting his family in upstate New York in Elmira when he received the news. He admitted, "I think his book kept him alive for several months. He was a very great man and superlatively good." Clemens attended his funeral and watched from his publishing office during the 5-hour procession. After various arguments emerged that Grant should not be buried in New York City, Clemens felt that he had to speak up about it. He mentioned, "But as long as American civilization lasts, New York will last. 20 centuries from now, New York will still be New York, a vast city. I observe that the common and strongest objection to New York is that she is not national ground. Let us give ourselves no uneasiness about that. Wherever General Grant's body lies, that is national ground." The memoirs were published posthumously, one volume in December of 1885 and the second around April of the following year, selling over 300,000 copies. Clemens was able to write a check to Julia for $200,000, the largest royalty check ever written in American publishing history up until that point. Overall, when all is said and done, she receives close to $450,000. And the memoirs are, of course, still very highly regarded to this day. Friend and author William Dean Howells wrote to Clemens, "I'm reading Grant's book with a delight I've failed to find in novels. I think he is one of the most natural, that is, best writers I ever read." The book merits its enormous success simply as literature. Clemens called the book a great, unique, and unapproachable literary masterpiece, and although he was praised for his assistance with helping Grant, during Clemens's own bitter financial woes, he remarked, "That terrible book, which made money for everybody concerned except for me." Clemens also spent his time wrapped up in lawsuits regarding the sale of the memoirs and was often in and out of court fighting for payments due to the publishing company trying to halt the trade sales of the novels. He became particularly entangled with a man by the name of John Wanamaker, a merchant from Philadelphia accused of trying to sell the memoirs by trade rather than by the subscription publishing. A news article in Philadelphia quoted Wanamaker that Clemens had fallen asleep in court. Clemens' answer, he said he wanted printed in the newspaper. "I did not go to sleep in the courtroom. I fainted. It happened in this way. One of Mr. John Wanamaker's clerks was talking to me, and I said, 'You ought to know that man's character well. You look like a man accustomed to low wages and hunger.' Now, in view of the fact that he had been picking Mrs. Grant's pockets in the intervals of keeping Sunday school, is there really any kind of property that he wouldn't take in case he wasn't being watched?" The man answered with a grave judicial impressiveness which imparted indescribable weight to the words he uttered. Laying his hand softly upon my shoulder, he looked me in the eye and said, "Dear sir and friend, if John Wanamaker had been around just after the crucifixion, I should not have been oppressed with these lifelong doubts as to what went with the body." Clemens had success and failure with the various court cases, but felt it was important for his wallet and reputation to stay on top of it. With the booming success of these memoirs, Clemens felt emboldened to make additional business decisions and investments, specifically in a typesetting machine called the Page Compositor. This machine has 18,000 movable parts and was supposed to revolutionize the printing industry. Clemens sank hundreds of thousands of dollars into it, and it never worked properly. Because of that, it resulted in his own financial calamity. His publishing company, Charles Webster, fared no better. The early success of Huckleberry Finn and Grant's memoirs was short-lived, and the business began to deteriorate as quickly as Clemens and his nephew Webster's relationship. Clemens blamed his nephew-in-law for his incompetence at running the firm for its failure and resulting financial issues. He was relieved of his post in 1888, and the firm filed bankruptcy in 1894. They never spoke again. However, similar to General Grant, Clemens was able to find his way back. His interminable drive led to successful lecture tours across the globe, which then resulted in future book releases and ultimately solid financial footing by the time of his death in 1910. One of my favorite quotes about Grant from Clemens is succinct and straightforward and true. I want to send you one of my publications, The Autobiography of General Grant, which I think is the most admirably simple, direct, and unpretentious story that was ever put on paper by a supremely great man. I think it is a marvel of monumental modesty. These two giants of American history and literature are as different as they are the same. Their lives, of course, each filled with triumph, travel, adventure, tragedy, and by their end, their own form of unquestionable immortality. So with that, I'm going to conclude this portion, and I'm going to hand it over to my friend and colleague, Steve Courtney, and he's going to take you the rest of the way.
Hello, I assume I'm being seen. I'm very sorry not to be, oh no, I'm not being seen, sorry. Here I am. I'm very sorry not to be with you in Harrisburg. For family reasons, I'm here in Connecticut, and where I have worked with both Jeff and with Mallory, who's hold your applause, I guess, but we're going to give a huge one for her presentation. It was just terrific. I would like to see the next slide. Well, there we are. Okay. All right. As Jeff mentioned, Mark Twain had a close friend who was a minister. Here are the two friends in old age, the Reverend Joseph Hopkins Twichell and Samuel Clemens, the redoubtable Mark Twain. I've named my Twichell, Ulysses S. Grant, Mark Twain, and the President's Toe. Here we have, it often surprises people to think that Mark Twain's closest friend was a minister, a Congregationalist minister, no less, from Hartford, Connecticut, the city where Mark Twain, Samuel, and his family lived for 20 happy and productive years of their lives. Twitchell's, what appealed to Clemens was Twitchell's earnest affection for those he met, his storytelling abilities, his sense of humor and camaraderie, and even his sometimes risque jokes. Reverend Twichell always called him Mark. I may find myself calling him that in the course of this quick talk. Another thing that appealed to Mark, Joe, was, as he wrote, he breathed the smoke of 100 battles. Twichell was born in Connecticut, graduated from Yale in 1859. As a young seminarian in New York, he joined ex-Congressman Dan Sickles' Excelsior Brigade as a chaplain, and the regiment that eventually became the 71st Regiment, New York Volunteer Infantry. And with that, we move to the next slide, I hope. There he is. Here he is. He, as a chaplain, his rank was equal to that of a captain, and thus he was justified in wearing a sword for his formal photograph, even though he never actually took it out of its scabbard, as far as I know. But he took part in the Peninsula Campaign, in the run-up to the Second Bull Run. He was in Chancellorsville, Fredericksburg, and Gettysburg, not finally, but at Gettysburg, where he held the chloroform as Sickles had his leg amputated. As you probably all know, the general had just sent his Third Corps on a controversial move into the peach orchard, from which they tumbled back to the Twain barn and beyond. And in the next slide, we see the Twain barn, of course, shortly after the Battle of Gettysburg. The whole business of the move of Sickles forward, of course, was a matter of endless debate. I think the the debate has probably been largely settled, but not in Sickles' favor. Twichell, however, felt Sickles was responsible for winning the battle. The following spring found Chaplain Twichell with Grant's overland campaign. He traveled with the army through the battles of the Wilderness, Spotsylvania, Cold Harbor, and the beginnings of the Petersburg siege, passing an old Peninsula campaign campsite. He said, he wrote later that he thought of the days that we had wall tents and expected to take Richmond as one would pick cherries. But now, of course, it was total war with Grant in charge, helping the surgeons in their grim tasks after Cold Harbor. He wrote to his brother, "I have been up to my elbows in blood all day. A pile of loyal Maine arms and legs is the token of what the day's work has been." He returned to seminary in 1864 and accepted the pastorate of Hartford's Asylum Hill Congregational Church just after the war ended. It was in Hartford in 1867 that he met Clemens, who was in town on a business trip to see about the publishing of his first major book, a travel work called The Innocents Abroad. And here in the next slide is Twichell himself in that era. And in the next slide after that, there was going to be a picture of Mark Twain, but Mark, you probably know what he looked like. Only in those days, he didn't have white hair. He had reddish hair. In a parishioner's parlor, we'll get to this slide eventually. In a parishioner's parlor, he began a conversation that ultimately took them to the palm-lined roads of Bermuda, where they loved to walk, the depths of the Black Forest in Germany, the glaciers of the Alps, and the Connecticut hills. They were great walkers, these two, and great talkers together. Mark and his wife, Livy, moved to Hartford with their children and the house there, just a few blocks from Joe and Harmony Twichell's house. The two men and their families passed through joys and tragedies. When apart, they wrote letters to each other. Hal Holbrook, who played Twain on stage for many decades, describes their letters back and forth as two friends talking. You get more of Mark Twain, the unguarded person, from these conversations between two friends than from the biographies. In their later years, Twichell could be a consolation and support to his friend. After Twain's daughter Susie died in 1896, the author wrote that he didn't want anyone else to write letters to him, but he did want Twichell to write to him. He wrote, "You have the touch that heals, not lacerates." Twichell was content to serve in this role. "All right, Mark," he wrote, "go ahead. I give you free leave to siphon out to me all such secretions whenever they accumulate to the pitch of discomfort." Twichell also served as a foil to the humorist who reveled in skewering his pal. In one letter, after one of Twitchell's piously optimistic outbursts about the future, Twain replied with a famous maxim: "When a man is a pessimist before 48, he knows too much. If he is an optimist after it, he knows too little." And Twichell was 66 years old, so you can see where he fit into that. When Grant and Clemens began the association that Mallory has told you about so well, Twichell was clearly interested. One day, a Hartford friend asked Twichell for a favor. The friend was Jung Wing, the initiator of an effort to bring 120 young students from China to New England to study. It was a project of deep interest to Twichell. And yes, this is a picture of one of the classrooms in Hartford of this amazing group of students. In 1881, conservative Chinese officials wanted to end the program, and Jung wanted Twichell to talk to Grant, to Ulysses S. Grant, by that time a former president, into lending his prestige to keep the program alive. Because as you probably know, after his presidency, Grant made a round-the-world trip, which included a visit to China, where he became acquainted with the viceroy Li Hongzhang. And when Lee greeted Grant, I love this story, he greeted him by saying, "You and I, General Grant, are the greatest men in the world." Twichell, however, was petrified at this request. He didn't know Ulysses S. Grant. He said, he wrote, "How could I dare?" He said that I had served under General Grant in the Army, but was personally quite unknown to him. But then he thought of his friend Mark's budding friendship with Grant and brought him into the effort. Grant was in New York at the time, and Twain and Twichell went to see him. Twain describes with relish Twichell's nervous preparation for this visit. And here's Mark Twain. "Joe had been sitting up nights, building facts and arguments together into a mighty and unassailable array, and had studied them and got them by heart, all with a trembling, half-hearted hope of getting Grant to add a signature to a sort of petition to the Viceroy of China. But Grant took in the whole situation in a jiffy. And before Joe had more than fairly got started, the old man said, 'I'll write the Viceroy a separate letter, and bring strong reasons to bear upon him. I know him well, and what I have to say will have weight with him. I will attend to it right away. No, thanks. I shall be glad to do it. It will be a labor of love.' So all Joe's laborious hours were for naught." And Grant's efforts, sparked by Jung, Twain, and Twichell, succeeded in prolonging this Chinese educational effort in New England. Now maybe go to the next slide. Here's a more elderly Twichell. On the day Grant died, July 23rd, 1885, Twichell wrote in his journal, "This event had been looked for and painfully waited for by the whole nation, but its occurrence moves the public heart in a manner wonderful to see and glorious. In me it revives in full force all the loyalties, burning, unreserved, which as a youth 20 years ago I felt for my commander, and memories of great days and scenes never to be forgotten with which he is associated." He wrote to Twain, "Dear Mark, I think I never wanted to see you so much. In fact, that I never wanted to see anybody so much as I have you the past 10 days to talk over General Grant. I'd give anything for a day or two with you just now, sitting or strolling around and letting our converse run freely where it would through the whole subject. Your heart is full of it, I know, and mine certainly is." He praised a letter that on Grant that Twain had sent to the Hartford newspaper just days after his death. It quoted Thomas Mallory, the 15th century chronicler of King Arthur, on the death of Sir Lancelot. "Thou were the kindest man that ever strake with his sword, and thou were the goodliest person ever came upon among press of knights, and thou was the meekest man and the gentlest that ever ate in hall among ladies, and thou were the sternest knight to thy mortal foe that ever put spear in the rest." Now Twichell, who was a Connecticut abolitionist from youth, never forgot the real reasons for the conflict in which Grant strake with his sword, in that wonderful language of Thomas Mallory. At an otherwise innocuous graduation week ceremony at Yale in June 1896, he left his script to express outrage over a well-meant gesture by the graduating class that filled him with horror. It was a custom for graduating students to plant a sprig of ivy along the wall of one of Yale's buildings as a memorial for the class. Someone got the idea of obtaining a sprig of ivy from the wall of the chapel in Lexington, Virginia, where Robert E. Lee was buried. The class of '96 would plant this ivy at Yale to celebrate the reconciliation of North and South. But the sentimental healings of time concealed infection. By the 1890s, Jim Crow laws and lynchings were becoming commonplace in the South. David Blight has written that racial apartheid was steadily becoming the law of the land. A month before Yale's graduation, The United States Supreme Court in Plessy versus Ferguson had enshrined racial segregation for the next 6 decades. On June 22nd, Twichell, in his role as a member of Yale's governing body, ascended a platform to dedicate a brand new bronze statue of Theodore Woolsey. Woolsey was the president of Yale in the 1850s when Twichell was a student there. And we can move to the next slide. There's the statue, it's still there. He begins by describing how Woolsey had encountered Twichell when the chaplain was on a visit home during the war. I met him walking up and down on College Street, waiting for the second bell, and with what warmth he greeted me, and at once began to ply me with questions about the Battle of Gettysburg, which had just been fought, and the Yale men who had borne part in it, and other things on the front, till there was not a second more to spare. It stood revealed in his whole tone and manner that he loved his country with all his hopes and fears. And this is when Twichell broke from his script, alluding to the statue's bronze face. And if I may be pardoned, I must say that if it were possible, that face would be averted from the scene when it shall happen this afternoon, if it so be that it shall happen, that an ivy from the grave of Robert Lee, a good man, but the representative of an infamous cause, shall be planted on this campus to climb the walls of ever loyal Yale. This caused a stir. The utterance of Dr. Twichell came like a clap of thunder from a clear sky, said a New Haven newspaper, and reported the aftermath. The seniors on the Ivy committee huddled, wondering what to do. You can't change the Ivy now, said one. 1/3 of the class are from the South, and it will be a personal insult to them if you do. But you are insulting the 2/3 of the class from the North, said another. A third proposed a statement that the Ivy had been chosen because it was a good piece of ivy, nothing more. Others rejected this idea because they thought they would show this respect, for a good man and their willingness to put aside the bitterness of sectional feeling. I wish the committee had selected the ivy from any old place so we wouldn't have had this talk, said a pragmatic committee member. It was a reversal of roles, old radicals and young conservatives. The older members of the audience applauded Twichell vigorously, the Yale Alumni Weekly reported. But the seniors kept still and looked glum. The ivy was planted nonetheless, Twichell wrote in his journal. Some gray-haired veterans threatened to tear it up, but the seniors vowed to defend it. The story went out over the Associated Press wire with Twichell's statement slightly improved for effect, and soon newspapers all over the country were having their say. Reverend Dr. Joseph Twichell has given the dry bones at Yale a healthy stirring up by a strong blast of loyalty, said one clipping in the scrapbook where Twichell carefully preserved mementos of this incident. I rubbed my eyes in astonishment, wrote Henry B. Goddard in the Hartford Times. It did not seem to me possible that the manly, noble, muscular Christian that I had known in Hartford could be so ungenerous upon such an occasion. A serpent's hiss at a great man's grave, said a Georgia paper. Letters poured into Twichell over the following weeks. An anonymous correspondent wrote, "Why is it that sectional bitterness is kept red hot north by preachers? Can't you draw by preaching the gospel?" A Louisiana letter read, "You may know my concern for your words of denunciation of the exponent of a lost cause, whose very name is a household synonym of virtue and chivalry in every American home south of the Mason and Dixon line." Friends and strangers offered support. Leonard Bacon, a ministerial mentor of Twitchell's, wrote, "I take sides with you in the matter of that rebellious ivy. It cannot be too positively impressed on the ingenious undergraduate mind that whatever they may think, we old folks have not yet come to the point of looking upon the Civil War as a football game upon a grand scale." 2 months later, A reporter followed up to see if the ivy remained. It was gone. Chaplain Twichell had, with his words, removed a Confederate monument. I tell this story in part because in relaying the pride and patriotism of an old soldier, it proves that there is nothing new under the sun. You who have studied the Civil War know that it was not a football game in any sense, though we can get caught up in diagrams and post-battle quarterbacking. But there were real causes behind the wall, causes that grew out of the forced labor of millions of kidnapped human beings. As I said, the statue remains on Yale's campus. You can see in the foreground that some of the original bronze is exposed and polished if you look at the foot that's closest to the camera. This comes from the custom of Yale students for generations. They rub President Woolsey's prominent toe for good luck. Perhaps there's a charm left from that moment of conscious and righteous anger from an old man who was Mark Twain's closest friend and General Grant's loyal soldier. Thank you.
Steve and Mallory will take a few questions if you have any for them.
How much, you said that Julia Grant had gotten $450,000 in money that, at that time, at that value. Any idea how much that would convert into in today's dollars?
Yeah, it'd be about $12 million. All right. Oh,
One more right here. Grant was recognized even during the war for his ability to write to accurately portray his intent through his orders. Did Twain ever talk, or did Clemens ever talk to Grant, or did Clemens ever comment on how did Grant develop this wonderful writing ability that he had to be succinct, accurate, concise, and did he ever talk about that?
He never really commented too much on Grant's writing. I think part of it was because he didn't, as I said in earlier, he didn't feel like he needed to. But I think Clemens privately was surprised at how wonderfully well written Grant was. And that, of course, is what fueled those rumors of people thinking that Twain or Badeau possibly had ghostwritten, because there's no way that Grant could have gotten across certain things as well as he did, not only from a strategic tactical point of view when he's talking about battles, but also just how well written he was in general. So Clemens didn't really speak too much about it besides a couple comments here and there when he felt he needed to.
You won the race. No, thank you. Very interesting presentation. I haven't read the memoirs yet, and I know that I should, and probably someday I will. What do historians say about the historical accuracy? Because, Grant is, dying of cancer, and then, he's writing about events that took place decades earlier. And of course, when people are writing autobiographies and memoirs, there's always a tendency to embellish or to leave out certain unsavory details. So what can be said about, the historical accuracy of the memoirs?
From what I've heard Civil War scholars talk about, that is extremely accurate. And part of that reason is because as Grant is writing, he has assistants that are checking maps and dates and locations to make sure it's as accurate as possible, considering he is writing about something that happened 20 years beforehand. I think the last I'd heard, I don't know if it's still true, is that it's required reading at West Point till this day, that they require their students to read the memoirs. So I think that speaks volume in itself. War memoirs were also very popular during this period, obviously. Clemens did publish some others during this time period. He re-released and reissued Sherman's memoirs in the 1890s. He also published some work by McClellan and Elizabeth Custer, her book Boots and Saddles. But unfortunately, nothing did as well as Grant's. And I think that gave Clemens a false sense of security for his publishing company, including the unfortunate misguided thought that everyone would want to buy a book about Pope Leo. So that's really what ended up failing his publishing company. It did not do well. So Grant and Huckleberry Finn were really the best books that his publishing firm put out. But from what I have heard, it is extremely well done and accurate. Yes, Mr. President.
Sorry, 200, that's all. As far as the memoirs are not meant to besmirch anybody. He doesn't speak critically on anybody in the memoirs. It's a reminiscence of sorts, but the military section of it is highly, highly fact-checked by his staff and himself, because when he wrote it, he did have maps about. He pulled up copies of all his orders that he could designate and follow those to make sure he is pinpointing things. He's not dishing on anybody. It's not proper for that time period for people to write that way, and he would certainly not do that on his way out, being a true Victorian sentimentalist to that regard.
What role did Grant's son play in it? I remember reading the Mark Twain things, and his son played a big role in gathering the information and organizing it. And my guess is he would help him. He wasn't a writer either, but I just sense that he had a very big role in everything, in all of that.
Yes,
I think it was Fred.
His son was also the one that Clemens, I would say, communicated with the most. So they were in constant communication through letters. His son would update him when Clemens came to visit Grant about health issues, the status of the memoirs, and what was being worked on. So he really was essential to Clemens in staying up to date on what was going on with Grant. I know that for a while, I think a couple of his sons considered potentially buying into Clemens's publishing firm, Charles Webster and Company. They wanted to buy in for a certain percentage of the firm, but unfortunately Webster was against that, and Clemens eventually decided it was not a good idea as well. But there was a long history between Clemens and Fred Grant in particular. And what's really interesting, and I highly recommend if you haven't yet, there's another tie which I unfortunately did not have time to talk about today, between a local Hartford sculptor named Carl Gerhardt and Grant. He was friends with the Clemens family and was hired eventually to do a bust of Grant, and then later got into a lot of hot water regarding Grant's death mask. So that is another connection between Grant and Clemens that I didn't have time to talk about, but I highly recommend looking into to see more of that interaction between them.
I hate to be the question and a comment guy, but I'm going to do a question and a comment.
Sure.
There was a book published about, 5-6 years ago by a historian named Frank Varney. It is titled General Grant and the Rewriting of History. And as the title implies, Varney, he kind of takes a deep dive into the memoirs, and he does point out some inaccuracies. And one example is that Grant was caught flat-footed at Shiloh. He wasn't anticipating an attack, and in the memoirs, Grant said, "Oh well, we were ready, we were prepared." And so, there's a couple arguments like that. I don't agree with everything Varney does, but there are some historians that have critiqued the memoirs. But I think at the same time, Grant said in the introduction to the book that he said there's bound to be mistakes. This is my telling of the story. Mm-hmm. So I think it's important for us that he is. It's a personal reflection. It's Grant's personal truth of what he experienced. So you have other histories that can supplant it, but it's his story. Mm-hmm. And my question is, Twain would go to New York City to see Grant. Did Grant ever go to Hartford to see Twain at his house?
No, unfortunately. I always wish that Grant visited him at the Hartford house. Grant visited Hartford, especially stumping for other candidates after his presidency was over. So Clemens did meet with him in Hartford, but it was for campaigning and not for personal reasons. We know that he never visited the house, unfortunately.
Thank you, Mallory, and thank you, Steve. I think you're out there somewhere still in the Ethernet. We'll take about a 10-minute break, and then we'll have our curator talk about these wonderful artifacts up front. So it's 3:33, 43. Yeah, so come back about a quarter of, and we'll wrap up with our final session. Thank you.